The images are horrific. Other countries are coming to the fore and taking in large numbers. In Europe, it's a big challenge right now, but when you know that 3,000 people have drowned just this year, you know that we have an obligation to start acting.
The Liberal Party, months ago, even before this campaign, talked about setting an initial target of 25,000 Syrian refugees.
We have resettled already some 20,000 Iraqi refugees and a couple of thousand Syrian refugees, and we have plans to do more. But, you know, I would say repeatedly that as we are doing more, we can't lose sight of the fact that refugee resettlement alone cannot in any part of the world solve this problem.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rosemary Barton. Welcome to the show. The escalating migrant crisis in Europe hit Canada's election campaign today. Stephen Harper is defending his party's record on bringing in refugees, but his opponents accuse the Conservatives of failing to help out in the global humanitarian crisis. The debate was touched off by the tragic image of a dead Syrian child that circulated across the globe today. We're going to show you that image, but first we need to warn you that the photo is quite disturbing, so if you need a moment to look away, do that now. The boy was found lying face down on a beach near the Turkish resort of Bodrum. He was one of at least a dozen Syrians who drowned crossing the Mediterranean trying to reach Greece. That photo, and this is the reason why we're showing it to you, captured the desperation of migrants and revived the emotional debate over Canada's role in the crisis. So, are we taking in enough refugees, and are we taking them in fast enough? Or is the real solution, as Stephen Harper says, in part at least, ramping up the military fight against ISIS? Joining me now, John McCallum, an Ontario Liberal candidate, by Skype tonight from Ajax, Ontario, Conservative candidate Chris Alexander, he's also the minister. And here in studio, Paul Dewar, the Ontario NDP candidate. Good to see you all. Appreciate you being here. And Chris Alexander, I'm going to start with you tonight, if that's okay. At this stage, do you think, given what we've seen on the news, that that's one graphic picture, but we've seen many pictures of people stuck in train stations in a fairly desperate situation, do you believe that Canada is doing enough to help Syrian refugees?
I think Canada remains a model of humanitarian action. We are one of the top donors to the much larger numbers of refugees in the region, both fleeing the crises in Iraq and in Syria, and to all the UN agencies and other agencies that are responding to these millions of displaced people and refugees. We also are the most generous country to refugees in the world. We take 1 in 10 resettled refugees annually, and our numbers for Syria and Iraq are going up dramatically. As a response to that, the Prime Minister made an announcement during the campaign. We're proud of those efforts. But we also, Rosemary, have to accept that no one will be able to resettle all these refugees. The ones that have come through human smuggling, through across borders, bribing officials, paying for train tickets and airline tickets, they are the lucky ones. There are millions more caught in the crossfire in these countries, and they are victims of jihadist terrorism that needs to be stopped in Syria and in Iraq. We stood against it in Afghanistan, prevented the Taliban from coming back to power there. We need to do the same and not stand in the sidelines militarily in Syria and Iraq.
Okay, but that's not what I'm suggesting. I'm asking what to do about refugees, and I take your point that you believe Canada is doing enough and that we can't help all of them. But surely there can be more. You can't look at those pictures and say that we've done enough.
No, that's why Prime Minister Harper at the beginning of this campaign added a commitment of 10,000 more Syrian refugees to be resettled to this country. I announced 10,000 to be resettled.
Most of them are private sponsored, though, privately sponsored. Those aren't government sponsored refugees.
Absolutely not. Government assisted refugees remain a huge component. We take as much private sponsorship as we can, but we use government assistance for those who are most vulnerable, and we will continue to do that. But Rosemary, my answer was about refugees. We will have a growing refugee crisis in that region and in Europe as long as jihadi terrorism goes unaddressed in Iraq and Syria.
I take your point. I take your point. And just a quick fact check. According to the Canadian Council for Refugees, in 2013, government-assisted refugees totaled 5,000, and there were 6,000 privately sponsored refugees, compared to in 2000, for instance, where the numbers were vastly different. 10,000 government-sponsored refugees versus 2,900 privately sponsored refugees. So things have obviously changed over your time in government. Paul Dewar, what do you think?
Let me add, Rosemary, that if you look at private sponsorship of refugees and refugee flows since 1979. Conservative governments have on average taken 20,000 refugees per year, liberal governments 10.
Oh, nonsense.
Well,
Okay,
sorry.
Paul Dewar.
Yeah, I mean,
That fact
Chris,
is
I'm
absolutely
sorry,
true.
but Chris on this is completely wrong in terms of what the government's approach has been. They had to be dragged kicking and screaming to actually admit 1,300 refugees. That was a catastrophe from the government side because they couldn't tell us, if you remember, for a full year, asking how many of those refugees have actually come. At the same time, Germany, Sweden, other countries were taking in tens of thousands. So look,
In
this
part
is
because
what,
they are closer, to be fair,
closer,
Mr.
no,
Dewar.
but they had a policy and they had a commitment. You know, Chris mentions 1979. I remember it well. My mother was the mayor of Ottawa, and she opened the doors of Ottawa to 4,000 refugees at the time, and the government changed its numbers to 60,000. It was a proud day for our country. What the hell are we doing now? We have been asked by the UNHCR a year ago spring to bring in 10,000 refugees. So when we hear the government say, oh, we're going to admit 10,000, it's a year too late from when we were asked. And it should be, Chris, I haven't interrupted you, so please, thank you. And we need to have done it.
Just a minute, Mr. Alexander, I'll let you respond, I promise.
We should have been doing 5,000, as the NDP asked, that year, and another 5,000.
Okay.
And finally, we've said to do that, and then those should be government ones, and then on top of that, private sponsorship.
Okay, Mr. Alexander, quick response, and I want Mr. McCallum to get in there.
Well, first of all, the numbers today are significant.
What are they?
Paul talked about
What are they?
Okay, let him finish. Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Alexander.
The repatriation resettlement program, it went up to 50,000 and even beyond.
You're not answering the question.
We have over 20,000 refugees here from Iraq.
It's not. We're talking Syria. Talking Syria
Okay,
today.
okay. Not everyone can hear. Mr. Alexander, finish your thought. Yep.
The
Today
people
it's Syria.
are from Iraq as well.
We're
They are
talking about
victims
Syria
of
today,
the
though,
same
Chris.
jihadist
That child was from
terrorism.
Syria.
Okay, Mr. McCallum, what more do you think should be? Let me bring in
The
Mr.
sad thing about the NDP,
Well-
they cannot distinguish between.
We can distinguish between Iraq and Syria. Chris.
Gentlemen, no one can hear anybody.
Terrorism
Mr.
and a
Alexander.
humanitarian crisis that
If-
is also caused by terrorism.
If
Okay,
Chris
Mr. McCallum, go
Alexander
ahead.
would
Mr.
let me
McCallum.
say something.
Yes, go ahead, Mr. McCallum, your turn.
This is obviously a crisis. Justin Trudeau has committed and repeated again today 25,000 government-assisted Syrian refugees. And I must say that Canada, over the decades, under both progressive conservative leaders like Joe Clark and Brian Mulroney and Liberal, have always been generous to refugees, whether it was Hungary or Vietnamese boat people or Uganda. But Chris Alexander and this government is a total disgrace to that long-standing tradition. I remember not so many months ago, he hid from media, he hung up on As It Happens because he did not want to admit the pathetic number of Syrian refugees he had admitted. He has denied basic health care to refugee applicants, even though a judge has said it's cruel and unusual and therefore unconstitutional. So nobody believes a word that Chris Alexander says about refugees.
So let's let Mr. Alexander answer here. How many refugees, Syrian refugees, has the government brought in to date? Syrian refugees that were overseas, not already here.
Approximately 2,500. The numbers grow quickly through private sponsorship and government assistance. We also have brought over 20,000 Iraqi refugees when neither the opposition nor many others were talking about that crisis since 2009. We have a total commitment, half of it delivered, of about 50,000 refugees to be resettled from Syria and Iraq. And obviously the main effort is on Syria right now. That is in Canada's best tradition.
When will that happen, Mr. Alexander? What is the timeline on that commitment?
Well, for the 10,000 that I announced, it was this year, next year, ending in 2017. For the 10,000 the Prime Minister announced, it's over 4 years, so it's in the coming years. And these resettlement populations will dominate our refugee resettlement, as they should, given the scale of this crisis.
Fair to say, though, Mr. Alexander, that most of those sponsorships are private. Why is the government not doing a matching program?
No, that is not fair to say.
It's not fair to say.
I'm not sure why you keep saying that.
Well, it's
because it's a fact.
No, it's not a fact. We don't have a policy of accepting a certain number of private sponsorships and having another number for government-assisted.
No, but 60% are falling to private sponsorship, are they not?
As we did with the Vietnamese boat people, we take as many through private sponsorship as we can, because then taxpayers' dollars go further. But what is conspicuous by its absence in Mr. McCallum's comments as it always is from Justin Trudeau and Liberals, is any mention of the source of the problem. The Vietnamese came because Saigon fell and Vietnam fell under communist rule. The Iraqis and Syrians are leaving their countries because jihadist terrorism is at a high watermark in the Middle East and in the world. And we will not help the tens of millions of people affected unless we take military action in those areas with our allies, Arabs, Turks, NATO allies, under the leadership of President Obama. The two opposition parties in this country are totally offside with Canadians and with the international community by opposing this mission.
Okay, Mr. Dewar and then Mr. McCallum.
You know, I just met with Nigel Fisher this afternoon. Nigel Fisher, the government's actually asked him in for advice on how to deal with the issue. And he was the Ban Ki-moon's person on humanitarian crisis in Syria. I just met with him. He showed me the German plan, a 10-point plan for how to deal with the crisis, very comprehensive. And what does it say? It says you should bring in refugees, you should settle them, should match people up with their skills, make sure that they have the proper settlements, do it in an organized way. It's exactly what we should be doing. It's exactly what we ask the government to do. And here's what's missing.
So answer this. So what would the NDP concretely do? How many more people would you do it? And how would you pay for it? Because we're talking about a lot of people and it costs a lot of money.
Yeah, so we would have done what we were asked to do by the UNHCR more than a year ago, and we would have had 5,000 already in Canada now, and another 5,000 the next year, with an opening to as many private sponsorships as we're able to get. So it's 10,000 by government, as we were asked to do by the UNHCR, and then as many as we could do through private.
Okay, Mr. McCallum?
Well, the NDP has a $28 billion fiscal hole, so they might have trouble paying for anything, but that's a different topic.
Yeah, right, John.
We have announced...
Way to get it in there, though.
That was so smooth, John.
25,000 government-assisted refugees.
Yes.
That means that the government is paying for them.
So that is not private refugees.
Canadians will
so, Mr. McCallum, just to be clear, that is not privately sponsored. The private-sponsored refugees would be on top of that number?
Exactly.
Okay.
We want as many as possible privately sponsored. The Conservatives have focused on privately sponsored, and they've shunned the church groups that approach their department. They've treated them with disrespect. I have heard that from religious groups all over the map. They do not take refugees seriously, which is why Chris Alexander keeps trying to change the subject to military. We are serious about this. Canadians are serious about this.
Okay.
It is unacceptable to discriminate refugees by religion, which is another thing that the Conservatives do. I think both Brian Mulroney and Joe Clark would be utterly ashamed of the total departure from long-standing traditional.
Okay, let's let Mr. Alexander respond to that.
Led by this
Mr. Alexander respond to that, but also, is there anything that you could do immediately to help? A cash infusion, some sort of emergency measure? Is there anything you could do right now?
Well, we've seen this crisis coming for years in Syria. We are at the forefront of donors to the UNHCR and other agencies in the region. The cash will continue to flow because it's the biggest humanitarian crisis of our times. Church groups are integral to Canada's efforts. We are focusing, as the Liberal Party has never done, on vulnerable ethnic and religious minorities. They are among those persecuted the most, losing their lives the most, and we will continue to harness the best that Canada has to offer.
Okay, but in the immediate, seeing the crisis right now and the photos people are seeing right now, is there anything extra Canada can do over the next week or 2 weeks or month? No.
Well, Rosemary, these numbers have been growing for years. There are 7 million people outside of Iraq and Syria. Half of the Syrian population inside the country is displaced. That has been the case for over a year and a half. We are continuing to act to be at the forefront of humanitarian response.
But Mr. Alexander, you're actually countering your own point. If that is true, if this has been going on for years, why did the government not act faster now?
Exactly.
I'm actually interested in why this is the first Power and Politics panel we've ever had on this.
Mr. Alexander, that's completely false, and I can send you links to the previous shows that we've discussed about this. We're discussing it during an election campaign because there's a crisis situation going on in Europe right now. But if you'd like me to send those to you, I can, because you've been on the show previously and discussed it.
I've never been on the show in a panel discussion on these issues.
No, because you weren't allowed to do panels as a minister. That's why you're here now. If you want to avoid the question, let's just be clear that that's what's happening.
I don't want to avoid the question, Rosemary. You want to avoid the fact that the biggest conflict and the biggest humanitarian crisis of our times has been there for 2 years, and you and others have not put it in the headlines where it deserves to be.
That's
I'm
right.
happy that it's there right now.
That's
I'm happy
total
that
nonsense.
Canada is a major
Chris,
donor.
we had a full study at this committee. At committee, we had a full study,
I
and
think
I've been on
Mr.
this
Dewar will have a turn
panel
now.
many times on this very program on this subject. So I'm sad that you're not allowed to be on programs like this when you're a minister. But we discussed this. We had a full committee report, as you know, at the Foreign Affairs Committee, which was at the behest of our party, which pushed the government for refugees, which your government did say to have commit to the 1,300 finally, which was not sufficient. So, Chris, you're right in that this is something we all saw coming. The problem is your government failed to act, and I must say, with due respect to you, sir, you failed to act as a minister, and you just said it earlier when you said you only got 2,500 in, and after we've been asked by UNHCR for 10,000.
Mr. Dewar,
you failed.
Mr. Alexander, you can respond to that, sir.
How about
Well,
me?
you have
Yes,
failed
Mr.
to
Alex.
acknowledge reality. The 20,000 Iraqis that have come
We
to this
welcome
country
that.
over the last 4 or 5 years, you never acknowledge it.
Yes, we did.
Also,
No.
you never
You
did
make everything
have
up, Chris, so
some
I'll leave that for others.
And you also failed in an abject way
Okay.
to do anything about the source of this problem, which is jihadist terrorism.
So where was I last year? I was with your colleague, Minister Barrett, in Iraq this very day a year ago.
Okay, Mr. McCallum wants one.
Chris, you have no credibility.
Mr. McCallum wants one more turn here, and he can get it. And Mr. McCallum, you can. Mr. McCallum, you can
You're
also.
one of the people who wants to bomb
Mr. Alexander,
It's my turn,
I'm going to
I
ask
think.
Mr. McCallum a question now, and
Chris,
part of it you can respond to this. And Mr. McCallum, part of the response will be, if you are promising 25,000 government-sponsored refugees, how long will it take for that to happen under a Liberal government?
Within 3 years, and Justin Trudeau said today that is a beginning. So
Is that
it may
even
be-
possible, though, given how long it's taking this government to get 10,000
Do
in?
you know what? It depends on the political will. Back in 1956 at the Hungarian Revolution, when Canada was tiny, the minister himself went over there and arranged the boats, arranged the processing. We brought over, when Canada was a tiny country, I think it was 35,000 refugees in a single year. Why do you think we've had very, very few refugees in this country compared with Germany, compared with Sweden? Because this government doesn't care. It is a departure from Brian Mulroney, from Joe Clark, from Canadians' long-standing traditions. And I would just say that I think Chris Alexander's constituents agree with that, which is why I think Mark Holland will win the election in his riding.
Okay, that was also a little talking point, but I guess that's all fair game right now. And we're here, we're going to leave it. And Mr. Alexander, I'm going to send you links of the many times that we've discussed Syrian refugees on this program and on CBC News Network.
I'll send you the committee
Will be a
report.
great MP for Markham Unionville.
I'll send you the
John-
Foreign
No
Affairs
longer
Committee
my
report on
riding, I'm
Syria,
Markham
too.
Thornhill.
John McCallum, Chris Alexander, who's welcome back anytime, and Paul Dewar. Thank you all.